I basically want you guys to understand what your legal entitlements are and how to kind of go about securing them. And then we're going to just have a brief look at some of the funding that could be available to you to help you secure support for your child with ADHD. Because as they say, it takes a village to raise a child with ADHD. Now, I know that some of you may not have children with ADHD, may have kind of broader special educational needs, autism, dyslexia, learning disabilities. Now, this presentation is also going to be helpful because although it is kind of focused on ADHD, we are talking about the special educational needs and disabilities legal framework. So it should all be relevant. Okay, so let's get started. Just going to share my screen. Let me know if you can't see it, but hopefully you can. Okay. So I'm going to try and limit the presentation to 45 minutes so that we've got a chance for questions, but it's really important that I get the information out to you. So if I go over 45 minutes, that's what I'll do. And hopefully, if you've got any questions, then you can always reach out to us. Happy to have a call with you and see what we can do to help you. So let's get started. Okay, so just about the ADHD Advocate. So we're all about educating and inspiring children, their families and teachers to understand and embrace ADHD. And more importantly, we like to empower our parents to advocate for their children's rights to support at school so they can learn and thrive. Now, we're not just limited to supporting parents and children in the educational context. We also actually coach, train, and advocate for people in the workplace as well. So our different coaches have got different specialisms. So yeah, we kind of, a whole family affair, because ADHD is a bit of a whole family affair. So I think we're quite uniquely positioned to really support the families and all the different kind of needs that will vary within the family, because it is really important that we take a joined up approach. So this is just what one of my clients said after I helped them with securing an education, health and care plan, which is very nice. So my background, I'm a former Magic Circle lawyer. So I used to work in banking in Allen and Overy, actually. I never was in anything to do with SEND before, special educational needs. Now, I'm not actually admitted to practice here in this country. Just want to qualify that. I was admitted to practice in New South Wales, Australia. I've only gotten across the special educational needs framework through my own kind of personal experiences and now obviously with clients. But this is not legal advice that I'm giving you today. I know this is what us lawyers do. This is just going to be guidance around the SEND legal framework for you, but not legal advice. I'm not delivering this in my capacity as a lawyer. But yeah, just going to clear that one. So I'm also a member of the Education Association and National Governance Association, because I used to be a primary school SEND governor at a mainstream school. And currently I am an ADHD coach, founder of the ADHD Advocate. I trained, as well as my other ADHD coaches, trained at the ADD Coach Academy, or are in training with the ADD Coaching Academy. It's really important, if you do get ADHD coaching for yourselves or your children, that those coaches are certified. And the ADCAR is only one of two ADHD coaching providers certified by the International Coaching Federation. So yeah, it is important if you're looking for coaching to do your checks. And I'm also chair of trustees of ADHD Action. And so basically ADHD Action, that was founded by Michelle Beckett, who is my co-founder of ADHD Unlocked membership community. She's amazing. She formed the all-party parliamentary group for ADHD. It had been like, I don't know, 10 years or something. A lot of ADHD charities were trying to get the all-party parliamentary group in place, and she managed to do it. So yeah, it's really, I think they also tried to petition for the ADHD Act, which we will talk a little bit about later on. But more importantly, I've walked in your shoes. So I know what it is I know what it's like to have a child with these ADHD challenges. Firstly, not knowing that it's ADHD, and then finding out, then basically trying to secure support for your child. Once you know they've got ADHD, well, what do you do about it? And ADHD or other special educational needs. So I've been through the journey. Basically, all my family have got ADHD, and things at home were extremely difficult before we knew, and before we got proper treatment and support through coaching, ADHD and medication. And for my daughter, education, health and care plan. That was a game changer, an absolute game changer. And that's why it's really important. And I'm so glad that you guys have turned up to find out how you can go about securing similar support, because for Eva, it completely transformed her life. Before, when she was in a mainstream school, she very low confidence, she wasn't able to learn. And now she's at a specialist school through getting an education, health and care plan, where she's getting occupational therapy, speech and language therapy. You know, all the lessons are kind of, they integrate this multisensory approach. So because our kids with ADHD, they need to really be interested in order to engage and to learn. So the delivery of education, the way it's delivered, is really, really important. And this is why our kids with ADHD in the mainstream school system are struggling. There's sensory overwhelm as well, the huge numbers in the classes. But also it's just that kind of delivery, and particularly because of the pandemic, it's that kind of just rote learning is not something us ADHDers are very good at, because we're much better and more engaged when we can see the why behind everything, the context and the relevance. So this school that Eva's at is just brilliant for her. And she was sick the other day, and she pretended not to be sick because she wanted to go to school. That's how transformative this stuff is. I'm pretty sure, and do share in the chat. If you've got children that are school refusers, do let us know. But if they are, it doesn't have to be that way. Okay. So yeah, what's your story? Probably looks a little bit like this. I mean, it certainly did for us, and I'm not going to lie, it does look like that for us occasionally, but very much not with my oldest daughter in the school that she goes at. My younger two are still in mainstream. And obviously in that mainstream schooling environment, I'm finding that I still need to be quite involved and kind of advocate for my children's provision, which we'll talk about in a bit. But does your home life, bit of school life, as you can see, this teacher telling off the child, a very common ADHD picture in schools, unfortunately, because our children with ADHD need to kind of move around. They're big verbal processors. They're so full of ideas and things in their head that in order to kind of get clearer, they need to verbally process, which is why coaching works so well for ADHD, is because it's like filing for their heads. But the problem in mainstream schools in particular, that type of behavior targets our children for getting picked up and maybe going to detentions if they're moving, if they're talking. But actually what they're trying to do is trying to engage themselves, trying to learn. So our children are getting punished for trying to learn, which is not ideal, and which unsurprisingly, our children start getting a negative view of school and education, because, you know, they're damned if they do, damned if they don't. And yeah, that's got to change. So as their parents, it's us that unfortunately, as you probably know, with your own schooling experiences, it's us that kind of need to lead the charge on this. So that's hopefully what I'm going to try and do for you guys today, is to be able to equip you with at least some basic knowledge to be able to go in there and advocate for your children's rights to support. So unfortunately, the state of education today is a little bit challenging. The pandemic, even before the pandemic, schools, and I know because I was a governor in a school before the pandemic, schools' budgets are so restricted, obviously in the mainstream schools. Now, mainstream schools, they get the SEND funding from the government, but it's not ring-fenced. So for each child on the SEND register, it's not official. That was all kind of done away with the 2014 SEND reforms. But with kids that schools are monitoring as having SEN, basically, it's really, I've just kind of lost my train of thought. Sorry about that. I was just thinking about what was happening in my current mainstream schooling, in my current mainstream school. But it's really difficult because the money for SEND funding is not ring fenced. And because schools are so short, just on everything, basically, we had our school, I remember asking for tissues and I think it was paper at one stage, I'm not sure, but that's how under-resourced schools are. So inevitably schools were using some of their SEND kind of funding just for the basic kind of funding, which obviously is not ideal, but it leaves nothing for our children with SEN. So this is where the education, health and care plan becomes crucial, because It's the only way in which you can ensure that your child will be supported at school. It's through an education, health and care plan, because unfortunately we can't rely on that SEND funding and really the SEN support in schools. That might be generalization. There may be some schools that really have amazing SEN support, particularly the schools that tend to have more pupil premium. They've got more money, and so they're able to use that pupil premium towards SEN. But a lot of schools, particularly in the privileged areas, they just don't have the cash. So the pandemic just took things to the next level. Already our teachers were, their mental health was struggling with the GDPR regulations that came into place. All the teaching staff just were completely just up to their eyeballs in regulations. And then obviously the pandemic hit. And that obviously for parents got a taste of what it was like for the teachers trying to teach their children at school. But I've heard mixed reports. My kids homeschooling, actually, I was working, it was my husband that supported the kids very well. But us parents as well, having to work, particularly if you're a parent with ADHD, trying to homeschool your child with ADHD, do share your experiences on that one. But it's not usually a pretty sight. Parents with ADHD have their own executive function challenges, have their own emotional dysregulation, and trigger very easily when their children are maybe a bit slower to kind of get to understand, or maybe having meltdowns themselves that will then kind of sensory will trigger the ADHD parent as well. So it was really difficult. So I have to say, for you parents there that homeschooled, and particularly if you've got ADHD, well done. And I bet you are very, very relieved that that is over, at least for now. So the impact on young people in education, it's not great, as we talked about. A lot of children with ADHD, a lot of them aren't even diagnosed because ADHD can present differently in girls. A lot of girls can mask very well. And so the school doesn't see the ADHD. And so when you go for a diagnosis for ADHD, unfortunately, you often don't get the diagnosis because ADHD must be present in at least 2 settings. And so, that at home, I'm sure you'd see the ADHD, but then you get the school saying, don't see any traits. And so you don't get the diagnosis. And that can be a real issue because, again, ADHDs are pretty resilient, particularly the girls. They kind of put up with things for so long, but only for so long. And as the demands of schooling and all the social pressures, as they increase, unfortunately, girls with ADHD, particularly in high school, tend to kind of crash. And we don't want that happening. So really want to intervene early. The earlier we can get the support, the earlier we can get these kids diagnosed, the better, right? And it's not to say about just label everyone. That's not what I'm saying at all. It's just that particularly with ADHD, the label, as you will see, as we'll come to, opens up the support, okay? But also ADHD medication, separate topic, but it also allows your child to take ADHD medication if you are open to that. And again, for my daughter Eva, for many of my clients, it has been transformational. So we've done webinars on this, which again, you can access, just get in touch. If you subscribe to our blog, we can get you the recordings. But yeah, at the moment, the current state of education, lots of kids school refusing, lots of kids basically being excluded from school. You've got lots of detentions and kids are just, they're feeling hopeless. And their parents equally so. Now, in order to change the law and make things better, the government created these SEND reforms back in 2014. So you've got the Children and Families Act 2014. Okay, so that's your main kind of act, the main legislation. So in that, basically covers all the kind of requirements that local authorities and schools need to meet in relation to special educational needs, as well as other things. But you've also got the Education, Health and Care Plan process in there as well. And that's got to be read in conjunction with something called the SEND Code of Practice. Now, what I see a lot of, and something to be mindful of, is that schools and local authorities quote the SEND Code of Practice like it's law. It is not. It's not law. It's only guidance. So basically, under the Children and Families Act, which is law, it's legislation, right? There's a duty to have regard and you know, to the SEND Code of Practice. So schools need to have regard to the SEND Code of Practice, but it's not the law. The law trumps, so the Children and Families Act, whatever's in there, will override the SEND Code of Practice, whatever's in the SEND Code of Practice, okay? But while there's some alignment or consistency, then you can follow the SEND Code of Practice if nothing in the Children and Families Act kind of negates the application. So we'll go into that a little bit more, but I've seen letters from local authorities in relation to requests for EHC assessments, quoting the Code of Practice. No, that's illegal. Law trumps local authority policy. The law trumps the SEND Code of Practice, and there's a specific test for educational health and care plan assessments, which we will go into, and which, when you get the slides, you'll have that to quote back at the local authority, because yes, don't get me started on what they do. But it's not helpful for us. Unfortunately, it really does place us parents as advocates. We do have to push it, unfortunately, but it is worth it. It really is. So the government does have a new autism strategy. Now, us ADHDers tried to kind of push the ADHD strategy through the ADHD Act, ADHD Action, petitioned, I think the government back in 2017, but unfortunately we weren't successful. But autism was successful because they've got these huge charities like the National Autistic Society that are, you know, really backed with a lot of money, a lot of resources and people, and they push through the Autism Act. And this is the third national strategy, I believe. And this third strategy actually covers young people, whereas before it didn't. Now, this is actually good news for us ADHDers as well, because according to statistics, I think the comorbidities, which is like the co-occurrence of different conditions, for autism and ADHD, we're talking 54%. So over half. So over half, that's quite high. So basically, this autism strategy requires schools to be trained up in autism. Also, I think they're going to like limit waiting times for assessment and things like that. So at present, us ADHDers, we can get on that bandwagon, because a lot of our kids with ADHD will have autism as well, or at least autistic traits. Okay, a lot of ADHD and autism, the traits do overlap, that hyperfocus, that inability to transition, right? Also, you've got that emotional dysregulation. There are, obviously, autism is more of a social communication type of disorder. Don't like that word, but there's some overlap. So really, this is still a good thing. And it's a great thing, really. Any requirements on schools to learn about neurodiverse conditions is very welcome and very much needed. But in addition, in relation to ADHD, it's still something that we need to proactively educate schools on. And we're excited to announce that we're going to be we've created a teacher training CPD program that we're going to try and get out to the schools, and we'll give you the details of that so that you can actually contact your SENCO at your school, and maybe their next inset day, get them to do the training. Because yeah, when you know better, you do better. And unfortunately, schools really don't have much awareness around ADHD or the actual law around SEND support. I know this firsthand. So the more educated you are, the better chance your child will have of getting the support that they need in school. Now, Special Needs Jungle, I don't know if you've heard of that, but if you haven't yet subscribed to Special Needs Jungle, I really, really recommend it. It gives you updates, and there's updates from legal professionals there, as well as other, occupational therapists and other people in the industry that are really going to be very helpful for you and your child. Now, this is a snapshot of where the state of EHCPs are in England. Now, this is more around the 2020 year as opposed to this year. But as you can see, EHCPs are rising. They used to be called statements, but I think there's like 430,697. So there's this 10% yearly rise. It's continuing. And as you can see here, where the children with EHCPs are, still 40%, the bulk of them are in mainstream. There's special educational needs units, but then you've got 36% special school. And so that's really really nearly equal. And as you can imagine, these special schools are not cheap. Now, with the education, health and care plan, you see, depending on the needs and the provision your child needs, you can name the placement of the school. So you can name, say, well, for instance, like something like Fairley House, which is a specialist school for dyslexia. But there are lots of other schools that are going to be helpful for your child with ADHD, but also dyslexia, other needs. And there are a lot more people naming these schools, these special schools. And once that placement has been approved, then the local authority has a binding obligation to secure that placement, as in the local authority pays for that school. So we're talking a lot of money in some cases. So I think, specialist schools cost around $35,000 a year even. And if you get an education, health and care plan with a placement of special school like that, then the government funds that placement. So it's a lot of money for the government. And so it's no wonder that all the local authorities are in deficit. And it kind of explains why local authorities, their first reaction to a request for an EHC assessment is no, needs are not severe enough, or the child's got this support now, so, they don't need an assessment at this time, which is, again, illegal. But they're probably doing this, they're pushing back because they've got no money. But again, no excuse, it's illegal. Just really want to emphasize that. Okay. So this is scary statistic. As of January 2021, local authorities reported that 15,000 children and young adults with EHCPs weren't in any form of education, employment, or training at all. And that number's nearly doubled over just 2 years. So obviously the pandemics had a part to play here, but there were still over 11,000 young people in this category in the months prior to lockdown. So clearly something's not working. So there is this SEND review that the government has been conducting for a few years now, much to the disappointment and annoyance of all the special needs kind of advocates waiting to see some changes, some positive changes. Now, there was a final hearing of the House of Commons Education Select Committee. They had the SEND inquiry, and not unsurprisingly, they found that there was a lack of accountability, that the provision was very much like a postcode lottery. It's true, depending on which local authority you kind of live in, you fall under, they're going to have a different policy. They're going to have different kind of availability of provision for your child, because they're under the law. Each local authority has to publish kind of their offer, their SEN offer, which you can find on their websites. If you haven't yet looked, do have a look at your local authority's kind of SEN offer. Just do a Google search and you'll be able to see that there, but it does vary from borough to borough, which, yes, not ideal and not really very fair. So there are fundamental flaws in the way the Act has been implemented. And that's what is trying to be achieved through the SEND review, is to see some tightening up, some more accountability, some more training around SEND, and very much calling out these local authorities that are employing these illegal practices. The SEND inquiry concluded, now this is really important, the system does not help those families that do not have knowledge or resources to navigate their way through it. And sadly, this is the case. The application, the Education, Health and Care Plan, it takes a lot of time. It's quite a bit of a nightmare process. When I first applied personally for my daughter, Eva, I'm a lawyer or was a lawyer, and I found it was difficult. I mean, firstly, I had to learn, all the law around it, but then the application itself as well. There's a lot of evidence that's required. So just another kind of helpful hint here, try and correspond with the school via email, write things down. If your child is receiving SEN support and you're going to these IEP meetings, individual education plan, that is, write stuff down, document. If you are looking to put an education, health and care plan together, start pulling together everything you've got now. Start looking through all the emails, start, all the kind of assessment reports, school reports, because chances are if you've got ADHD, this stuff will be everywhere. So try, at least from now, get a folder, get all that stuff together. Okay. Yeah, you want to centralize all of that. It will make your life so much easier when you go to create your case for your education, health and care plan. And also some of these reports have got some really useful kind of recommendations for provision there. And if you have got reports, make sure that you forward them on to the school and that you get the schools to put that provision, those recommendations in place. Okay. Again, if your child doesn't have an education, health and care plan, you have to do more and you have to be on it, unfortunately. It does take a lot of time, but that's why it is preferable to have an EHCP. So we've got to get educated. I won't go very much into detail around kind of the landscape, who's running the show, but you've got these, obviously, these governmental departments, the local authorities, then the schools. And it's the legal obligations on the local authorities in the schools when it comes to identifying special educational needs and obviously supporting it. So the local authorities, like I said earlier, they're the ones that are on the hook for delivering the provision under the Education, Health and Care Plan, the local authorities. It's a legally enforceable contract. So yes, there is the rise of the parent advocate for precisely the reasons I described. We need to be on it, unfortunately, and there's lots of kind of movements, and there've been marches, SEN marches as well, and judicial reviews over decisions, particularly during the pandemic when there was a, I can't remember what it was called, the COVID bill, I think that's what it was called, but the COVID bill, they actually disapplied some of the requirements on the LAs to provide provision for kids that under EHCPs. So everyone was kind of up in arms. They reduced the standard, they increased the turnaround times for education, health and care plans, but it wasn't too bad actually in practice, thankfully. But special needs jungles say that it wasn't too bad in comparison because they weren't really doing much at all before that anyway. So that's just to give you an idea of what you're up against. So yes, how can you get the best support for your child with ADHD or other special educational needs or disabilities? We need to lean on the law. Now, I'm not saying you go in there literally with the boxing gloves. Okay, that's not going to get you very far with the school, particularly if you don't have an education, health and care plan. We have to take a collaborative approach. Okay, again, just being mindful that the school is probably, and the SENCO in particular, because you know, ADHD diagnoses are rising, more kids are being diagnosed with learning disabilities. So we've got to, you know, collaborate and kind of be mindful of the pressure. And so whatever you can do to help make that support getting into place easier for the school, the better. Now, one thing, schools may tell you your child's needs are not severe enough for an education, health and care plan. In fact, SENCO at my school said that about my daughter, Eva, and she was not right. And you'll find this a lot. SENCOs do not know the law. But if you do, and you know, you can actually point to it literally, you know, the specific clause, bring in the act. And I'm going to actually, if you subscribe to our blog, I'm going to give you kind of a list of resources, hyperlinks, so that you can get into the actual legislation as well. But if you can show them the law, what can they do, right? So yeah, you need to equip yourself with the law. Now, special needs jungle, I won't go through all of this again. Unfortunately, we don't have time to go into the detail, but you can educate yourself with the SEND support process in schools. Special needs jungle, that's what this is from. Again, I will forward this to you along with the recordings, or this will be in the slides at least. And it just kind of tells you what the graduated response is to special educational needs. But yeah, you can basically, it starts with obviously meeting with the child's class teacher. Sometimes it'll be the teacher or the SENCO that will come to you and alert you of the needs. And then you agree a plan of action using the assess, plan, do and review cycle, right? Now, again, schools have no money, so they can't afford to get an educational psychologist in to assess your child. So actually, more schools are getting on board with applying for education, health and care plans, because that's how they get the educational psychologist to assess. But again, schools being under so much pressure, being under-resourced, they're not exactly going to be incentivized to suggest to you that your child could have an education, health and care plan, because it does mean more work for them. The paperwork is huge. So again, if you do all of that, because you can apply for an education, health and care plan. It doesn't have to be the school. You will need to get the school involved, but you can actually do the application yourself, and you can find these requests for assessment on your local authority's website. So basically, so it starts with this SEND support. And this is kind of these are the actual legal duties around securing SEND support. So firstly, local authorities, they've got a legal duty to identify children with special educational needs and disabilities. So that's under the Children and Families Act. Then the governing bodies, i.e. the school, right? Under the Children and Families Act, they've got a legal duty to use their best endeavors to secure that the special educational provision called for by the pupil's special educational needs is made. Okay, so note that that's a best endeavors duty. It's not an absolute. It's not that they must secure the provision called for by the children's special educational needs. It's a best endeavors duty. Okay, so they will look at, the funding. And unfortunately, again, a lot of schools just don't have that funding in order to secure. But if they're making efforts, say maybe they've moved your child to the front, or maybe they're kind of breaking instructions down a bit more, they could maybe prove that they're using their best endeavors. So again, see, the SEND support, it's just not as robust and helpful to us as an education, health and care plan. There's also the duty not to discriminate. So there's specific disability discrimination under the Equality Act. So that's something that you can lean on as well, which we'll talk about soon. There's a public sector equality duty on the school, to make sure that they don't discriminate, that they foster good relations, and there's equal opportunity for all their pupils. And then there's also, very importantly, an anticipatory duty to make reasonable adjustments under the Equality Act. So when we talk about special educational provision and reasonable adjustments, it's kind of a similar thing. It's your support. That could be speech and language therapy, that could be occupational therapy, it could be as simple as having kind of fidget toys, which we'll quickly go into reasonable adjustments. Now the SENCO, there's actual SEND regulations which kind of detail all the specific requirements of the SENCO. Again, I can provide you with a link to those regulations. And then awarding bodies. So for instance, when your child does GCSEs, A-levels, the awarding bodies, because they're also subject to the Equality Act duties, they've got to provide reasonable adjustments to the pupils that sit the exams. And that's in the form of access arrangements, which I'm not sure if any of you have got those in place for your children, but if you don't, and your children are doing exams, then you might want to start getting them into place, talking to your SENCO and getting those into place. So this is just some information on reasonable adjustments. I'm just mindful of the time. Unfortunately, yes, we can't really delve very deeply into these things, but again, I can refer you to some examples of reasonable adjustments specifically for ADHD, but this is the duty here. So the school needs to have taken steps, reasonable steps. Again, they look at funding and kind of disruption to other pupils, but reasonable steps to avoid the substantial disadvantage to a disabled person caused by provision or practice applied by the school or by the absence of an auxiliary aid or service. So that's basically, for instance, if the school has a particular policy in place, and for instance, they're not kind of taking into account that the child, because of the child's needs, they can't kind of comply with that policy, then that's they've got to kind of make a reasonable adjustment. And then you've also got the reasonable adjustment in terms of the actual aids themselves, like giving the pupil a fidget toy or a timer or some other visual prompt or noise cancellation headphones. So it's a proactive duty. So access arrangements, there's just some information here in the slides. Again, I can give you a copy of the JCQ guidance, the current one for 2021-2022, but these are the kind of access arrangements available to your child with ADHD. Now, they kind of make ADHD fall under the social, emotional, and mental health needs. Now, ADHD falls under all 4 broad areas of need, which we'll talk about briefly. But these are the kind of main arrangements that are put into place, and there's specific requirements. Like, for instance, the SENCO, I think, needs to apply to JCQ for extra time. I think it's 25% extra time. Other things, I think the school can just, again, on the advice of the SENCO, or which is usually informed by, say, a report from the specialist, whether that's a psychiatrist or occupational therapist. So all that evidence is going to be very helpful and needed in order to be able to get some of these access arrangements. But if anyone needs any help with access arrangements, I can signpost you to someone that knows all about this, specializes in this. So again, I'm not going to go into detail on the letter of the law, but it is in the slides so that you have this information so that you can quote it as needed to your school. Special educational needs here. It's basically if your child's got a learning difficulty or disability which calls for special educational provision. Okay, now your child's got a learning difficulty or disability if he or she has a significantly greater difficulty in learning than the majority of others of the same age. So significantly greater difficulty in learning than the majority of others of the same age. So particularly if you've held your child back a year, okay, you're not going to be comparing the child to the other peers of that year group. It's a comparison to the age. So pretty much if your child's been held back a year, well, we know they've got this special educational needs, okay, or has a disability. So we're going to go into what the definition of disability is. But under the Equality Act, if your child's been diagnosed with ADHD, it automatically, the child falls under the category of having a disability. So you then have all the Equality Act entitlements that apply. So there are 4 broad areas of need. Now, this is kind of relevant in terms of, particularly for the Education, Health and Care Plan, because you kind of need to justify how your child's needs falls under all these 4 areas. Now, there's this thinking that ADHD only falls under social, emotional, and mental health difficulties. Not true at all. Definitely ADHD affects communication and interaction, cognition and learning, as well as the social, emotional, and mental health difficulties, and very much sensory needs. A lot of people don't actually appreciate that ADHD does come with sensory difficulties. So that's like sensitivities to noise, to taste, to light, even to heat. You know, a lot of kids with ADHD with these sensitivities, they can appear fine in class, and then all of a sudden just, you know, lose it. And that's usually because maybe someone's turned on the heater, or you know, it's just suddenly gotten so hot they're already juggling all these other things and trying to keep their cool, and it's just that one thing, right? One thing that just kind of tips them over the edge, but it's invisible. So not only have you got an invisible disability, but you've got these invisible triggers. And so then often that's why these kids with ADHD particularly are getting detentions or excluded from school, because they just look like they're being disruptive. You know, all behavior is a form of communication. It's important to remember that one. Not always easy to remember that when you're dealing with your own child having a meltdown, but really, really important. So this is the legal definition of special educational provision. So it's educational training provision that is additional to or different from that made generally for others of the same age. So again, that's like definitely occupational therapy, speech and language therapy. Your child might be being taken out of the classroom for kind of specialist kind of training, or social Lego therapy I've heard about, or just kind of, you know, intensive tutoring in maths or whatever. Now that is going to be provision, special educational provision. Now what I've found is that since the 2014 reforms, because, well, theoretically, they talk about kind of increasing the quality of the education. So there was this idea that if the quality of education was improved and increased, then that would be enough to meet most needs, even special educational needs. That would be enough. But that's not quite proving the case. But as you can imagine, if you've increased the quality of your education and provision, then it's going to be kind of harder to prove that your child's got special educational provision. But let's be honest, you know, the first quality teaching is not consistent across all schools and all classrooms, and particularly with the pandemic, it's been very difficult. Now, I'm not going to go into detail on education, health and care plans here, but again, I'm going to signpost you to the special needs jungle overview, which literally looks like a jungle. It is quite convoluted, which is why we will be running an EHCP workshop later on in the year as part of our parent training course, which I'll tell you guys about at the end. But yeah, it's a process. It's a process. And there's free help you can get from the likes of IPSI and also the Council for Disabled Children and this type of thing, Special Needs Jungle. It's a good flow. So I'll make sure that that's available to you. Now, I've touched upon this before. The main issue that I see when I'm doing education, health and care plans is that LAs often apply the law incorrectly. That's local authorities. They impose a higher threshold for EHC needs assessment, but the law trumps local authority policy and the SEND code of practice. Really important because I just see it all the time. All the time, these local authorities try to get away with this. It, yes, upsets me. So if you know better, you can push back and put these local authorities back into line. Because look, the legal test for an education health care assessment is that your child or young person has or may have special educational needs, and it may be necessary for special educational provision to be made. So, I mean, this test, the threshold, is a pretty easy one, particularly if your child's been diagnosed with something. Yeah, you can't really argue. Well, the local authority shouldn't be able to argue with that one, right? So the local authority must secure the assessment. But what I'm finding is that local authorities automatically just push back, and they do quote like the SEND code of practice or their own illegal policy. So be aware and have this handy. And literally, this is what I did, literally just write it back to them in their email or letter and remind them of their legal duties, and that they wouldn't want to breach the law, right? And this is the legal test for the education, health and care plan. So once you get approved, once that assessment is approved, it takes place, then you start your kind of forming your education, health and care plan. And well, that's if you get approved for an education, health and care plan after the educational psychologist assessment. But this is the test for whether you can actually get the plan. So the first thing is the assessment done by the educational psychologist. The EHC assessment is the first thing. That's your first hurdle. Then once you get that, the second hurdle is, well, according to the assessment, does my child meet this test, the legal test for an EHC plan? And as you can see, the requirements, the threshold is higher here. We're in the light of an EHC needs assessment is necessary for this provision to be made. Okay. It's necessary. And there's a whole load of case law around this, which would go into in the EHCP workshop. Now, I'm mindful of the time. We're talking about just quickly exclusions. Not sure if any of you have had children that have been excluded from school, seeing this a lot, particularly after the pandemic. These poor kids, right? Finally, their wishes come true. They get to not go to school and learn in an environment. Like some of the kids with ADHD have really thrived during homeschooling because they can learn in their own way at their own time, right? Without having the teacher that they hate breathing down their neck or embarrassing them in front of their peers. Because what happens is once that's happening, that the rejection sensitive dysphoria kicks in. And when not just the children, adults as well, when your rejection sensitive dysphoria kicks in, you can't access the cognitive, you can't learn. You can't work, right? So some ADHDers actually were able to catch up during this pandemic. But again, that did depend on the home environment and the situation. But exclusion. Independent schools aren't bound by the same laws as mainstream, unfortunately. So independent schools can get away with more, and that's the problem. So you've got to look at the contract, and you've got to look at their exclusion policies. The only way you could kind of fight it usually is to rely on disability discrimination, and that their policies, behavior policy, exclusion policy is illegal due to disability discrimination. But a lot of parents, from what I've seen, particularly if they've got other kids coming in the private school waiting, they don't go there, unfortunately. So yeah, it's harder in the independent schools, unfortunately. But in the state-funded schools, they've got this kind of prescribed test that they need to adhere to. So there's only permanent exclusion only in response to a serious or persistent breach of the school's behavior policy. And we're allowing the pupil to remain in school would seriously harm the educational welfare of the pupil or others in the school. So again, the threshold, it's got to be serious, persistent. It's got to seriously harm educational welfare of the pupil or others, right? So like, for instance, I see a lot of kids that get excluded from independent schools because of vaping, right? Now, wouldn't generally fall under this test if it was in a mainstream school, or at least it would be difficult to kind of prove, but not if you're an independent school with your own kind of exclusion and behavioral policies that stated, for instance, that was something that you could exclude for. So again, that's the issue with the independence. So this is just the definition of what a disability is. And ADHD, again, you get the diagnosis, because in order to get the diagnosis, it's got a physical, mental impairment. It has to be long-term, substantial effect on day-to-day activities. So by virtue of the ADHD diagnosis, it is a disability. It falls under the Equality Act, which then means that your child is protected under the Equality Act. So the Equality Act, just again to recap, so your school can't be discriminating against your child by reason of their disability, which also includes they can't exclude your child for behavior arising from their disability. That's unlawful unless the school can show the exclusion was proportionate towards achieving a legitimate aim. So this gets quite technical. And again, this is something that we can maybe do another webinar around. If there's a need for that, just let us know. But the school needs to know about the disability. They need to know. Knowledge is actually one of the requirements. And also that duty to provide reasonable adjustments. The school needs to have provided reasonable adjustments as well. So there's these steps, basically. But it's important to know that you can lean on the law in this respect if your child's been excluded. Okay. Yes, there was a huge win for autism, again, led by the National Autistic Society, but thankfully, very graciously, they extended this application of this relaxation of this rule under the Equality Act to all learning conditions and ADHD as well. So previously, if your child was excluded from school because, for instance, they were aggressive, right? Now, that you wouldn't be able to kind of rely on disability discrimination, because there was an exemption. There still is this exemption in the Equality Act that if it's a tendency for physical violence, that behavior arises from a tendency towards physical violence, then you can't rely on that disability discrimination ground. But thankfully, there was a court case back in 2018, and the judge ruled that the court basically ruled that that particular exemption doesn't apply. So that was a huge win, because as we know, so many pupils with the ADHD and autism, the reason why they're excluded is because of these kind of behaviors, right? Because it's part of that emotional dysregulation that is not very well known with the ADHD, because it's not in the Diagnostic Statistics Manual as a criteria for diagnosis, but it is very much a thing. So that was a landmark case and a real win for ADHDers. So hopefully, I know that was a bit of a whirlwind, but I really hope that it has equipped you with at least some of the terms, reasonable adjustments, disability discrimination, right? And hopefully you've got as well, when I give you these slides, you'll be able to rely on and quote from the legislation, so that if you are applying for an education, health and care plan, you don't get knocked over on the first hurdle. So, but again, just reiterating, take that collaborative approach, take a collaborative approach with the school, and then you lean on the law if you absolutely have to. But do educate them in a collaborative way, yeah? But it is up to us as parents to advocate and to educate, and it does take a lot of energy. So don't try and do it on your own. That's what we're here for. That's what these charities like IPSI and Special Needs Jungle, Council for Disabled Children, that's what they're there for, to help parents advocate for really much needed support for their kids. So these are some of the funding sources that are available for people with disabilities. So you've got the Disability Student Allowance, which is more for support for higher education. Education, health and care plans is the support for, you know, the so not higher education, so high school and primary school, nursery, education, health and care plans, which we've discussed. We've also got disability living allowance. Now, disability living allowance, you can get on top of an education, health and care plan. So you basically have to go through, it's another form that you can do. And I will provide you, where you can get a link via my website, via our ADHD Advocate website. All these kind of funding sources are laid out here, and you can get more details around disability living allowance. But a lot of people with ADHD, kids with ADHD, have both the education, health and care plan and DLA, call it DLA. So you get a certain amount of money, I think it's every week, and you can use that money. You can use that money to even get therapy for your child, anything to kind of help make things easier, so it's really helpful. Even coaching as well, coaching for your child, because we offer kids coaching. So that's a really good use of the money. And access to work. So if you're a parent with ADHD, and you either have your own company or you're employed, you can actually get funding for coaching. So at the ADHD Advocate, we have quite a few clients that their coaching is funded through the government, access to work. It's fantastic. It's a fantastic program. Again, more details around how to apply on our website. So that's www.theadhdadvocate.com. There's also some handy kind of resources around parenting as well. So it's time to tell a new story. You don't have to suffer. Your children don't have to suffer like this. I've seen this firsthand. I know how transformational this is, leaning on the law and getting the support that you need for your child. So I very much invite you to start leaning on the law, to reach out for support. We've got our next parent training course begins on the 1st of November. So if you'd like to sign up to that, do email us, let us know. It does include the EHCP workshop that I'll be doing. So any questions that you've got with the EHCPs, I'll be able to answer, but also I'll be taking you through the whole EHCP process, and specific to ADHD, but it would also be helpful if your child doesn't have ADHD. So that's 1st of November. Spaces are limited, so do let me know if you want to join that. And we've actually got our first kids meetup for Halloween, a Halloween children's meetup. It's a Halloween themed online play date. That's October the 27th at 4 p.m. And if you're interested in more details, our kids coach will be hosting that. And it's going to be fun. So they're going to be learning about ADHD and meeting others with ADHD, but they're not going to know really. They're going to be having too much fun. So yeah, let us know if you're interested in finding out more details. And this is the contact page, admin@theadhdadvocate.com. Get in touch, and we'll send you a recording, and obviously the resources, all the resources that I've been referring to. There's a list with the hyperlinks so that you can basically access that. So I'll stop the share now. There we go. Oh, thank you. I'm just having a look. I hope that was useful. I'm just having a look at some of your comments here. But oh, good. Yeah, this information is just not out there, and it really needs to be, doesn't it? Hopefully this really does make a difference. This can make the difference for your child, for their education, not just for their education though, because it affects their life.